I pulled into the parking lot of Eddie's Diner at 11:30, my headlights sweeping across the faded sign. The neon letters buzzed and flickered, casting a red glow over the empty asphalt. Only one other car sat in the lot, a beat-up Chevy I recognized as Derek's. The night air hit me as I stepped out of my car, cool and dry with that distinct Nevada emptiness that made every sound feel isolated. I walked toward the entrance, keys jingling in my pocket, wondering what my first solo night shift would be like. The diner sat alone on this stretch of highway, miles from anything resembling civilization. Derek was wiping down the counter when I walked in. He looked up, his face as weathered as the desert outside. The overhead lights made the gray in his hair more pronounced. "Right on time," he said, tossing the rag into a bucket behind the counter. "Good." I nodded, slipping my jacket off. "Not much traffic tonight." "Never is." Derek reached under the counter and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it flat with his calloused hands before sliding it across to me. "These are the rules. You need to memorize them." I picked up the paper, expecting the usual stuff about food safety or cash handling. Instead, I found a list of 5 handwritten rules that made absolutely no sense. 1. Only serve the living. 2. If the jukebox plays by itself, hide until the song is over. 3. If a little girl in a yellow dress knocks after midnight, put a spare uniform shirt under the door. Do not let her in. 4. Never look directly at the man in the dark coat. 5. The clock must never reach 3:30. Turn it back to 3 hours if necessary. I laughed, waiting for Derek to crack a smile. He didn't. "Is this some kind of initiation thing?" I asked. "Mess with the new guy?" Derek's expression didn't change. "This isn't a joke, Jay. Following these rules keeps you alive." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I read through the list again. Come on. Only serve the living? What does that even mean? Exactly what it says. Derek came around the counter and stood in front of me. Look at me. This is important. More important than anything else I've told you about this job. You follow these rules exactly. No exceptions, no questions. I studied his face, looking for any sign he was messing with me. His eyes were deadly serious, the lines around them deeper than usual. You're not kidding, I said. No, I'm not. He glanced at the clock. I need to go. You've got the basic training. Clean, serve customers, handle the register. But these rules, he tapped the paper in my hand. These rules come first before anything else. But no questions, just follow them. Derek grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. I'll be back at 6 to relieve you. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet diner with a list of bizarre rules that made no sense. I read through them again, trying to make some kind of connection. Maybe the place had a history of robbery, and this was Derek's weird way of giving me safety instructions. But none of the rules mentioned the register or what to do in case of a holdup. I folded the paper and put it in my apron pocket. Whatever Derek was worried about, I'd humor him for now. The job paid well, surprisingly well for a middle-of-nowhere diner. And I needed the money. The first few hours passed without incident. I cleaned the grill, restocked the napkin dispensers, and made a fresh pot of coffee. The radio played quietly in the background, some late-night talk show about conspiracy theories that seemed fitting given the strange rules in my pocket. Around 11:45, headlights swept across the windows as a semi pulled into the lot. The driver, a burly man with a week's worth of stubble, came in and settled at the counter. Coffee, Black, he said, his voice low and gravelly, and a slice of whatever pie you got. I poured him a cup. Apple or cherry? Apple. He wrapped his thick fingers around the mug. Thanks. I cut him a generous slice and slid it across the counter. Long haul tonight? Phoenix to Sacramento. He took a sip of coffee. Name's Nathan Rogers. Stop here whenever I'm on this route. I'm Jay. Just started. Nathan nodded. Used to be a guy named Derek working nights. Still is. Tonight's my first solo shift. Derek's a good man. Quiet, but good. Nathan took a bite of pie. This place doesn't get many visitors this time of night. Mostly just us truckers and the occasional lost tourist. We chatted while he ate. Nathan told me about life on the road, and I shared stories about the string of odd jobs I'd worked before landing at Eddie's. It felt normal, comfortable even. By the time he paid his bill and headed back to his truck, I'd almost forgotten about Derek's strange rules. Almost. At 12:58, the bell above the door jingled. I looked up from wiping tables to see a man in a dark coat step inside. He moved with an odd stiffness, like his joints didn't bend quite right. Without looking around, he walked to the corner booth and sat down, his back to me. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. Never look directly at the man in the dark coat. I felt a chill run up my back. Was this what Derek had been talking about? I kept my eyes down, focusing on the table I was cleaning. From my peripheral vision, I could see the man sitting perfectly still, not even removing his coat despite the warmth of the diner. I waited for him to call out an order or at least acknowledge me, but he remained silent. Minutes ticked by. 15, then 30. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the highway outside. At 1:30, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a menu and approached the booth, keeping my gaze fixed on the table rather than the customer. "Can I get you anything?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. No response, not even a movement. I placed the menu on the table and retreated to the counter, my skin crawling. For the next half hour, I busied myself with mindless tasks, refilling salt shakers, wiping down already clean surfaces, anything to avoid looking at the corner booth. At exactly 1:58, exactly 1 hour after he'd arrived, I heard the booth creak. From the corner of my eye, I saw the man stand up. He walked to the door with the same strange, stiff gait and left without a word. The bell jingled as the door closed behind him. I rushed to the window, watching as he walked across the parking lot and disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, like he'd stepped into a shadow and never emerged. My hands shook as I locked the door. I pulled out Derek's list and read through it again. The rules that had seemed so ridiculous a few hours ago now felt like a lifeline. I remembered Derek's grave expression, the seriousness in his voice when he told me the rules would keep me alive. For the first time, I believed him. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every sound, checking the clock obsessively to make sure it never approached 3:30. Nothing else unusual happened, but the encounter with the man in the dark coat had been enough. Whatever was going on at Eddie's diner, Derek's rules weren't a joke or an initiation ritual. They were a survival guide. I wiped down the counter with a damp rag, swiping away a sticky ring left by someone's coffee mug. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night host talking about government conspiracies. I wasn't really listening. The diner sat empty, just me and the buzzing fluorescent lights keeping each other company. The jukebox lit up suddenly, its colored lights pulsing to life. I froze mid-wipe, rag still pressed against the laminate counter. The machine hummed, internal mechanisms clicking as a record dropped into place. The opening notes of Blue Moon filled the diner. My stomach dropped. Rule number 2 flashed through my mind. If jukebox plays by itself, hide until song ends. I didn't hesitate. I dove behind the counter, landing hard on my knees. Pain shot up my legs, but I barely noticed as I pressed my back against the shelves of clean mugs and plates. My breathing came in quick, shallow gasps as the music played through the empty diner. Frank Sinatra's voice crooned about standing alone without a dream in his heart, the sound bouncing off the walls and windows. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. The song wasn't particularly threatening, just a classic love ballad, but something about hearing it play without anyone selecting it made my skin crawl. I sat there counting seconds, trying to remember how long the song was. 3 minutes? 4? Every note stretched into what felt like hours. The lyrics about finding someone who cared for me drifted through the air as I huddled on the floor. The song played on, filling every corner of the diner while I waited, hidden and terrified of what might happen when it ended. Finally, the last notes faded away. The diner fell silent again, save for the soft buzz of the overhead lights and the hum of the refrigerator. I stayed put for another full minute, listening for anything unusual. Nothing. Just the normal sounds of an empty roadside diner in the middle of the night. Slowly, I rose to my feet, my legs stiff from crouching. I peeked over the counter, scanning the dining area. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Empty booths, clean tables, no customers in sight. I moved cautiously toward the jukebox, keeping my eyes on the door and windows. The machine stood silent now, its lights still glowing but no music playing. I examined it carefully, looking for any sign of what had caused it to activate. The coin slot was empty. I checked the mechanism, looking for loose change, but found nothing. No explanation for why it had suddenly decided to play Blue Moon in an empty diner at, I checked my watch, 2:30 in the morning. I backed away from the jukebox, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart still pounded in my chest, the rush of adrenaline making my hands shake slightly. I busied myself with mundane tasks, refilling salt and pepper shakers, checking napkin dispensers, anything to keep my hands occupied and my mind from spiraling. But I couldn't stop glancing at the jukebox every few seconds, half expecting it to spring to life again. Time crawled by. I kept checking my watch, counting the minutes until Derek would return for the morning shift. The radio continued its late-night programming, the host's voice a comforting reminder of normality in a night that had taken a decidedly abnormal turn. At 2:47, I glanced up at the wall clock and noticed the time. The mine at hand was creeping dangerously close to the half-hour mark. Rule 5 echoed in my head. Never let clock reach 3:30. Turn it back to 3 if necessary. I grabbed the step stool from beside the supply closet and positioned it beneath the clock. My hands trembled slightly as I climbed up, keeping my eyes fixed on the time. 2:48 now. I still had plenty of time. But something about the urgency in Derek's handwritten rule made me want to take care of this sooner rather than later. Standing on tiptoes on the top step, I reached for the clock. The plastic casing felt cool under my fingers as I carefully opened it. I hesitated for a moment, wondering what would happen if I just let the clock tick past 3:30. What was so special about that time? I thought about the man in the dark coat who had sat motionless in the booth for exactly 1 hour before vanishing into the night. I thought about the jukebox playing by itself. Whatever was happening here, Derek's rules seemed to be keeping me alive. I grasped the minute hand between my thumb and forefinger and gently turned it counterclockwise, moving it back to 12, setting the time to 3 o'clock exactly. The clock ticked on, seemingly unaware that I'd just erased 30 minutes from its count. Climbing down from the step stool, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I'd followed the rule, but why did it matter? What happened at 3:30 that was so dangerous it needed to be avoided? I returned to my spot behind the counter, leaning against it as I looked around the diner. Everything seemed so normal. The checkered floor, the red vinyl booths, the laminated menus stacked neatly at the end of the counter. But beneath that veneer of normality lurked something else. Something I couldn't see or understand but could feel in the pit of my stomach. These rules weren't jokes or the paranoid ramblings of an old man. The jukebox had played by itself. The man in the dark coat had vanished into thin air. Something was happening at Eddie's diner. Something beyond normal explanation. I pulled Derek's list from my apron pocket and read through the rules again, seeing them with new eyes. Each one seemed specific, targeted, designed to avoid particular dangers. Don't serve the dead. Hide when the jukebox plays. Don't let the little girl in. Don't look at the man in the dark coat. Don't let the clock reach 3:30. Each rule protected against something specific, something real. I folded the paper carefully and returned it to my pocket. The weight of realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. I wasn't just working a night shift at a roadside diner. I was standing guard at some kind of supernatural crossroads, following rules that kept whatever lurked in the darkness at bay. And somehow, I'd signed up for this. I'd agreed to work here, to follow these rules, to face whatever came through those doors between dusk and dawn. I glanced at the clock. 3:15 now. I'd reset it just in time. Whatever happened at 3:30 would be avoided, at least for tonight. But tomorrow night would come, and the night after that. How many times could I reset the clock, hide from the jukebox, avoid looking at the man in the dark coat before something went wrong? The radio host's voice droned on about government cover-ups and alien conspiracies. I almost wanted to laugh. If he only knew what was happening right here, in this ordinary-looking diner in the middle of nowhere. I checked the doors were locked, made a fresh pot of coffee, and settled in for the rest of my shift. Derek's rules clutched in my mind like a lifeline. Whatever was happening here, whatever dangers lurked in the darkness outside, I now knew one thing with absolute certainty. Following those rules was keeping me alive. I spotted her through the front window. A little girl in a yellow dress standing in the parking lot. She looked about 7 or 8 with a teddy bear clutched to her chest, staring up at the diner with wide eyes. My first thought was, what the hell is a kid doing out here at 3:15 in the morning? My second thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Rule number 3. If little girl in yellow dress knocks after midnight, put spare uniform shirt under door but don't let her in. She walked toward the entrance with slow, measured steps. Something about her movement seemed off. Too precise, too controlled for a child. I backed away from the window, my mouth suddenly dry. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty diner. The radio host droned on about government weather manipulation, his voice now just background noise to the pounding in my ears. The first knock came soft and tentative. 3 light taps against the glass door. I moved quickly to the entrance and flipped the sign from open to closed, then turned the deadbolt with a decisive click. My hands felt clumsy and numb, like they belonged to someone else. She knocked again, harder this time. I kept my eyes fixed on her yellow dress, careful not to look directly at her face. The fabric looked worn and faded, with small stains that might have been dirt or something darker. The teddy bear had one eye missing, its stuffing poking out through a tear in its side. "Please," she said, her voice sweet and clear through the glass. "I'm lost. Can I come in?" Every instinct screamed at me to help her. She was just a little kid, alone in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. What kind of person leaves a child outside in the cold desert night? The kind who wants to stay alive, I reminded myself. "I'm sorry," I called through the door, still avoiding her eyes. "We're closed." "But the lights are on," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I saw you inside. Please, I'm scared." My chest tightened. I glanced at the clock, 3:18. I thought about calling someone, but who? The nearest police station was 30 miles away. By the time anyone got here... "My mom and dad were just here," she continued, pressing her small hand against the glass. "They said they'd be right back. That was hours ago." I swallowed hard, remembering Derek's rules folded in my apron pocket. He hadn't explained why I couldn't let her in, but after what I'd seen the past few nights, I wasn't about to start questioning the rules now. "Hold on," I said, my voice cracking. I hurried to the back room where we kept extra uniforms. My fingers fumbled through the stack until I found a clean white shirt with the diner's logo stitched on the pocket. It felt stupid. What good would a shirt do for a lost child? but I wasn't about to start making up my own rules. When I returned to the door, she was still there, her face pressed close to the glass. For a second, I almost looked up at her eyes, but caught myself just in time, focusing instead on the collar of her dress. "I can't let you in," I said, crouching down, "but I can give you this." I carefully pushed the folded uniform shirt under the narrow gap beneath the door, watching as the white fabric slid across the threshold and onto the concrete outside. The girl stood motionless for several seconds, then bent down to pick up the shirt. Her movements were too fluid, like water pouring downward rather than a child bending at the knees. She held the garment up, examining it with her head tilted at an odd angle. "This isn't what I wanted," she said, her voice suddenly flat, all childlike sweetness gone. I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. She looked at the shirt for another long moment, turning it over in her small hands. Then, without another word, she tucked it under her arm alongside the teddy bear and began walking away, her steps even and measured. I watched her yellow dress grow smaller as she moved across the parking lot toward the darkness beyond. She never looked back. When she reached the edge of the lot where the asphalt met the desert sand, she simply wasn't there anymore. One step she existed, the next she didn't, like someone had switched off a projector. I stayed frozen by the door, waiting to make sure she was really gone. The clock on the wall read 3:28. The whole encounter had lasted just 13 minutes, but it felt like hours. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and flipped the sign back to open. The metal was ice cold under my fingers. I turned and looked at the clock again. 3:28. 2 minutes until I needed to reset it. I grabbed the step stool, positioned it under the clock, and climbed up. The plastic casing opened with a soft click, and I turned the minute hand back from 28 to 0. 3 o'clock again. Back on solid ground, I leaned against the counter and tried to steady my breathing. The radio host had moved on to discussing lunar landing conspiracies, his calm, reasonable tone a bizarre contrast to what had just happened. I pulled Derek's list from my pocket and read Rule 3 again. The paper felt worn between my fingers, creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. I wondered how many night shift workers had held this same list, followed these same rules, pushed a uniform shirt under the door for a girl who vanished into nothing. And I wondered what would have happened if I'd opened the door. I looked up from wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. It was 4:30 in the morning, and I hadn't expected any more customers. The guy who walked in looked like he'd had a rough night, and that was putting it mildly. His skin had this weird, waxy quality to it, like a department store mannequin left too close to a heater. His clothes were torn in several places with dark stains that looked way too much like dried blood. But it was his eyes that made my stomach drop. They were completely black. No whites, no irises, just two empty pools of darkness staring back at me. Rule number 1 flashed through my mind immediately. Only serve the living. I froze with the rag still in my hand as he walked to the counter with an odd, stiff gait. Each step looked calculated, like he was remembering how to walk rather than just doing it naturally. "Coffee," he said. His voice came out flat and hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Sorry, we're out of coffee." It was a ridiculous lie. The half-full pot sat right behind me, still steaming. The dead man, because that's exactly what he was, didn't look at the pot. He kept those black eyes fixed on me. "Pie, then," he said after an uncomfortable pause. I shook my head. "We're out of that too. Kitchen's closed for cleaning." Another lie. The display case to my right held 3 perfectly visible slices of apple pie and half a cherry. The dead man didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't seem to breathe. He just stood there, completely still, in a way no living person could manage. 1 minute stretched into eternity as we faced each other across the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the radio host droned on about government secrets. But all I could focus on was not looking directly into those black eyes while also not showing how badly my hands were shaking. Finally, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door with that same mechanical movement. I watched him go, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Through the window, I saw him cross the parking lot toward the desert. He moved in a straight line, never varying his pace until he reached the spot where asphalt met sand. Then, between one step and the next, he was gone. Just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and sagged against the counter. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to grip the edge to keep from sliding to the floor. I'd just faced down a dead man and lived to tell about it. After a few minutes of just breathing and trying to get my heart rate under control, I pulled out Derek's list from my apron pocket and read rule number 1 again: only serve the living. Such a simple instruction that now made perfect, terrifying sense. I tucked the paper away and grabbed the cleaning supplies from under the counter. For the next hour, I cleaned everything I could get my hands on, wiping down tables I'd already cleaned, mopping the floor twice, scrubbing at spots on the counter that probably wouldn't ever come out. Anything to keep busy, to keep my mind from dwelling on those black eyes and what might have happened if I'd poured him a cup of coffee. At 5:15, I checked the clock and saw it creeping toward 5:30. Remembering Rule 5, I grabbed the step stool, positioned it under the wall clock, and climbed up. I turned the minute hand back to 12, resetting the time to 5 o'clock. Better safe than sorry. I kept cleaning after that, organizing the condiment caddy for the 3rd time that night. Every small noise made me jump. The ice maker dropping a fresh batch, the refrigerator compressor kicking on, even the occasional car passing on the distant highway. Each sound had me spinning around, half expecting to see the dead man standing there with his black eyes and bloody clothes. At 5:45, I climbed back up and reset the clock again. 5 o'clock. The hands ticked steadily forward as I returned to my obsessive cleaning. The radio host had moved on to talking about alien abductions, his voice a steady background noise that I clung to for its normalcy. I made fresh coffee, even though I was too wired to drink any. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves a little, but I still checked over my shoulder every few minutes. No more unusual customers came in. No jukebox played by itself. No little girl in a yellow dress knocked at the door. Just me, alone in the diner, counting down the minutes until Derek would arrive at 6 and my shift would end. I kept thinking about the dead man and how close I'd come to breaking the first rule. What would have happened if I'd served him? Would I have become like him, with waxy skin and black eyes? Would I have disappeared into the desert, never to be seen again? The questions kept spinning in my head as I wiped down the same spot on the counter for the 10th time, my hands still not entirely steady. I felt my shoulders drop as Derek's beat-up Chevy pulled into the parking lot at 6 in the morning. The headlights swept across the diner's front windows, catching dust motes in their beams before cutting off. I'd been watching the clock for the last hour, wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. The bell above the door jingled as Derek pushed his way inside. He looked exactly the same as when he'd left me yesterday. Same worn flannel shirt, same tired eyes, same permanent frown etched into his face. The only difference was that now, after everything I'd seen, he looked almost normal. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff as he hung his jacket on the hook by the door. "Place still standing, I see." "Yeah." My voice came out hoarse. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Yeah, it's all good." Derek walked behind the counter and poured himself a cup of the fresh coffee I'd made 20 minutes ago. He took a long sip, studying me over the rim of his mug. "So," he said, setting the cup down, "how'd it go?" I took a deep breath. "I followed all the rules, exactly like you wrote them." "All of them?" Derek asked, raising an eyebrow. "Every single one?" I pulled the folded paper from my apron pocket and smoothed it out on the counter between us. The jukebox played by itself. Frank Sinatra. I hid until it was over. The little girl in the yellow dress showed up and knocked. I put a uniform shirt under the door, but didn't let her in. A dead man came in. I didn't serve him anything, even though we had coffee and pie, and I reset the clock every time it got close to 3:30. Derek nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. He didn't seem shocked or even particularly impressed, just satisfied, like someone checking items off a to-do list. "Good," he said. "That's why you're still alive." I stared at him. "You're not surprised? Surprised you followed the rules?" "No. You seemed like the type who might actually listen." He took another sip of coffee. "Surprised you survived?" "Also, no. The rules work if you follow them." The adrenaline that had kept me alert all night was finally wearing off, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I untied my apron and hung it on the hook beside the grill. "So," Derek said, watching me carefully, "I guess you'll be quitting now." I opened my mouth to say yes, of course I was quitting. What sane person wouldn't? But the word that came out surprised us both. "No." Derek's eyebrows rose slightly. "No?" he repeated. I felt as surprised as he looked, but something about making it through the night, about facing those things and surviving because I'd followed the rules, felt like an achievement, like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking. "No," I said more firmly this time. "I'm not quitting." For the first time since I'd met him, Derek's face changed. The permanent frown softened, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward in what I realized was a smile. It transformed his whole face, making him look 10 years younger. "The pay's good," he said simply. "Yeah," I agreed. "The pay is good." "Gets easier with time," he added, refilling his coffee cup. "You learn the patterns, start to predict things." I nodded, trying to imagine a future where any of this would feel routine, where I'd casually hide from self-playing jukeboxes and reset clocks like it was just another part of the job. "I'll see you tomorrow night then," Derek said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, tomorrow night." I grabbed my car keys from my pocket and headed toward the door. The morning sun was just starting to rise, painting the desert horizon in shades of orange and pink. The light spilled across the parking lot, illuminating every crack in the asphalt, every pebble and weed. Standing there in the doorway, with one foot in the diner and one foot in the sunlight, I realized something had fundamentally changed. My understanding of reality had shifted overnight. The world I'd known yesterday, a world where dead men stayed dead, where little girls in yellow dresses were just little girls, where jukeboxes needed quarters to play, that world was gone. I'd entered a new one, a world where supernatural things were real, where they had rules and patterns, and where only Derek's list stood between me and whatever waited in the darkness. I stepped fully into the morning light and let the door swing shut behind me. The walk to my car felt longer than usual, each step heavier with the weight of everything I now knew. As I slid into the driver's seat, I was already mentally preparing for my next shift, wondering what new horrors might visit the diner and how I'd face them. The desert stretched out around me as I drove home, vast and empty in the growing daylight. But now I knew better. It wasn't empty at all. I got to work earlier this time. The afternoon sun felt hot on my back as I walked across the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my sneakers. I'd barely slept after my first night shift, my brain replaying the strange events on loop. The man in the dark coat who disappeared into thin air, the jukebox playing by itself, the little girl in the yellow dress, the dead customer with black eyes. Derek's beat-up Chevy sat in its usual spot, a thin trail of smoke rising from his driver's side window. He was probably finishing a cigarette before heading home. I needed answers, and I wasn't starting another shift without them. The bell jingled as I pushed open the door. Derek looked up from behind the counter, surprise briefly crossing his weathered face before settling back into its usual serious expression. "You're early," he said, checking his watch. "Shift doesn't start for another 20 minutes." I walked straight to the counter and sat down on one of the red vinyl stools. "I need to know more about the rules." Derek studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. He poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one toward me. The ceramic mug made a soft, scraping sound against the laminate counter. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I pulled the folded paper from my pocket and smoothed it out between us. The 5 rules stared back at me, each one now carrying weight I couldn't have imagined before my first shift. "Everything," I said. "Where did these rules come from? Why does the jukebox play by itself? Who's the girl in the yellow dress? What happens at 3:30? And what's with the dead people trying to get served?" Derek took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. He set the mug down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "Each rule exists because someone died breaking it," he said simply. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat back, my coffee untouched. Someone died? More than one someone. Derek tapped his finger on the paper. "These rules aren't jokes or pranks. They're survival instructions." I swallowed hard. "So the jukebox, it's a warning," Derek explained. "When it plays by itself, something dangerous is approaching. The music creates a distraction. The thing outside can't focus as well when the music plays. That's why you hide. If it can't see you, it usually moves on." "What is it?" I asked. Derek shook his head. "Don't know exactly. Never seen it clearly. Don't want to." I pointed to the 3rd rule. "And the girl in the yellow dress?" "Not a girl," Derek said flatly. "Just looks like one. It's an entity that mimics a child. Figured out a long time ago that people are more likely to help a lost little girl. It wants to get inside. The shirt under the door is payment, I guess. Keeps it satisfied enough to leave without causing trouble." "What happens if someone lets her in?" Derek's face darkened. Night cook about 8 years back. Thought the rule was stupid. Let her in because it was cold outside. He paused. They found pieces of him scattered across 3 counties. The rest was never recovered. My stomach turned. I pushed my coffee away. "What about 3:30? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The barrier between worlds gets thin at certain times," Derek explained. 3:30 is when it's thinnest here. Reset the clock. You reset the energy buildup. Keeps things from breaking through completely." I nodded slowly, trying to process everything. "And the dead people?" Derek almost smiled. "Those are the easy ones. They look wrong. Move wrong. Eyes all black. They're persistent, though. Keep coming back night after night, hoping you'll make a mistake. What happens if you serve them? You become one of them." Derek's voice was matter-of-fact. "Serve the dead, join the dead, simple as that." I sat in silence for a minute, letting all this sink in. Outside, the sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. "Any other rules I should know about?" I asked finally. Derek considered this. 2 more things happen sometimes. At exactly midnight, the lights might flicker. When that happens, unplug everything. Toaster, coffee maker, microwave, everything. The energy attracts things you don't want to meet. And the other thing? Sometimes the coffee boils by itself. No heat, no reason. Just starts bubbling. Pour it down the drain immediately. Don't touch it, don't taste it, don't even smell it. Just get rid of it. I nodded, committing these new instructions to memory. "Any questions?" Derek asked, finishing his coffee. "Just one," I said. "Why me? Why hire someone for this job without warning them?" Derek's expression softened slightly. "Would you have believed me if I told you during the interview?" He had a point. "Besides," he continued, "you handled yourself well last night. Not everyone can follow the rules when faced with all this." He gestured vaguely around the diner. Most people quit after the first night, or they break a rule. He didn't need to finish that thought. Derek stood up, grabbed his jacket from the hook, and headed toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "You'll be fine," he said, not looking back at me. "Just follow the rules." The bell jingled as he left. Through the window, I watched him climb into his Chevy and drive away, leaving me alone with the diner and its supernatural secrets. I tucked the rules back into my pocket and tied my apron around my waist. The clock read 6:15. My shift had officially begun. The first few hours passed without incident. I served a few truckers, a couple of locals, and a family passing through on their way to Las Vegas. The radio played softly in the background, the host discussing alien abduction theories with a caller who claimed to have been taken 3 times. By 11:30, the diner was empty again. I wiped down the tables, refilled the napkin dispensers, and made fresh coffee. The normal routines helped keep my mind off what might happen later. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered. It started subtly, just a slight dimming, then grew more pronounced. The fluorescents overhead buzzed loudly, blinking on and off in rapid succession. The radio cut in and out, the host's voice warping into unrecognizable sounds. I remembered Derek's warning and rushed to unplug everything. I yanked the coffee maker cord from the wall, then the toaster, then the microwave. The lights continued to flicker as I moved through the diner, disconnecting every appliance I could find. The radio was last. As I reached for its plug, the host's distorted voice seemed to address me directly. Coming for "not alone," midnight, then silence as I pulled the cord. The flickering continued for another 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. The lights returned to their steady glow as if nothing had happened. I stood in the middle of the diner, breathing hard, listening to the sudden silence. After a few minutes, I plugged the appliances back in one by one. The radio came back to life with a different host discussing cryptocurrency. The coffee maker gurgled as it resumed brewing. Everything seemed normal again. For the next hour, I kept busy with cleaning tasks, jumping at every small sound. The wall clock ticked steadily toward 2 a.m. No customers came in, not even the dead man from last night. At 2:15, I noticed something strange with the coffee pot. The fresh brew I'd made after the flickering episode was starting to move, tiny bubbles forming at the surface. Within seconds, it was boiling violently, coffee sloshing against the glass sides despite the heating element being off. I remembered Derek's second warning: don't touch it, don't taste it, don't even smell it. I grabbed the handle with a dish towel, careful not to let any of the liquid touch my skin, and carried the entire pot to the sink. The coffee bubbled more aggressively now, almost as if it were alive and angry. A strange smell filled the air, not coffee, but something metallic and wrong. I poured it down the drain, watching as the liquid hissed and steamed when it hit the metal sink. For a split second, I thought I saw shapes forming in the steam. Faces maybe, or hands reaching out, before they dissipated into nothing. After rinsing the sink thoroughly, I made a fresh pot of coffee, watching it carefully for any unusual behavior. This batch brewed normally, smelling like regular coffee should. The rest of the night passed in tense anticipation. I reset the clock each time it approached 3:30, unplugging and replugging appliances whenever a light flickered, however briefly. The jukebox stayed silent. No little girl in a yellow dress knocked on the door. No dead customers came looking for service. By 5:45, I'd survived my second night at Eddie's Diner. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue. Soon Derek would arrive for the shift change, and I could go home to my apartment and try to sleep, knowing I'd have to do this all over again tomorrow night. I poured myself a cup of the normal coffee and sat at the counter, watching the minute hand tick toward 6. I'd followed all the rules and lived to tell about it, but as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That Eddie's Diner had more supernatural secrets to reveal, and sooner or later I'd have to face them all. I had a feeling the third night would be different. After 2 shifts of following Derek's rules to the letter, I'd started to develop a rhythm. Make coffee, wipe counters, reset the clock, and don't serve the dead. Simple enough once you got used to the idea that supernatural things were real and wanted to kill you. The first few hours of my shift passed without anything strange happening. A few truckers stopped by for coffee and pie around midnight. An older couple on a road trip came in around 1, ordered pancakes, and left a decent tip. I kept the radio playing softly, some late-night host talking about government weather manipulation, and went through the motions of keeping the place clean. By 2 a.m, the diner was empty again. I'd just finished wiping down the grill when I heard it. Jay? Jay, honey, is that you? I froze, rag still pressed against the warm metal surface. That voice, it was impossible. My mom lived in Oregon, hundreds of miles away. Yet I'd recognize her voice anywhere. Jay, please, I need help. I'm trapped back here. The voice was coming from the kitchen. I turned slowly, staring at the swinging door that separated the cooking area from the storage and walk-in freezer beyond. Mom? I whispered, then caught myself. This couldn't be real. My mother was at home, probably asleep at this hour. Whatever was calling me wasn't her. Jay, please! Something's wrong. I can't get out. The voice cracked with desperation, sounding exactly like my mom when she'd call me during a power outage or when her car wouldn't start. I backed away from the kitchen door. Derek hadn't mentioned anything about voices calling your name or mimicking people you knew. Was this a new rule he hadn't told me about yet? Jay Burke, I know you can hear me. Please, I'm scared. My heart hammered in my chest. The voice had every inflection right, every little catch in her throat when she was frightened. It even used my full name the way she did when she was serious. I glanced at the clock, 2:47, not quite time to reset it yet. I'm hurt, Jay. There's something in here with me. Please. I felt sweat breaking out across my forehead. The pleading was getting more desperate, and it took everything I had not to rush through those doors. My hands shook as I picked up the coffee pot and poured myself a cup, trying to focus on something normal. I raised you better than this. How can you ignore your own mother? That hit hard. The guilt was overwhelming, even though I knew, I was almost certain, this couldn't actually be her. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and tried calling her real number, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal. The voice changed tactics. Jay, remember when you were 7 and fell off your bike? I carried you 3 blocks home. Please, baby, I need you to help me now. That was a real memory, something only she would know. I looked up at the clock again and felt my blood run cold. It read 3:28. Shit, I muttered, dropping my phone on the counter. I grabbed the step stool and positioned it under the clock, climbing up quickly. But when I tried to turn the minute hand back, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, feeling the resistance like something was holding it in place from the other side. Jay, it's getting closer, please! The voice was louder now, more frantic. I kept trying to move the clock hands, but they were stuck solid. Sweat dripped into my eyes as I pushed with all my strength, but nothing happened. The second hand kept ticking forward, approaching 3:29. What do you want from me? I shouted toward the kitchen, losing my composure. The voice softened. Just open the door, honey. Just let me see you. I climbed down from the stool, heart racing. The clock was about to hit 3:30, and I couldn't stop it. The rules were breaking down. I needed something else. Some other protection. Then I remembered something Derek had mentioned in passing. Something about salt. I rushed behind the counter where we kept the condiments and grabbed the large container of salt we used to refill shakers. With shaking hands, I ran to the kitchen door and poured a thick line of white granules across the threshold, making sure there were no gaps. The moment I completed the line, a horrible shriek came from the kitchen. Nothing like my mother's voice now. It was high and inhuman, filled with rage. You cannot keep me out forever." The voice had changed completely, becoming a deep, guttural roar that made the windows rattle. I backed away from the salt line, watching as the kitchen door began to shake violently on its hinges. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the radio cut to static. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The door went still. The lights stabilized. The radio returned to normal programming. I looked up at the clock. The hands were moving freely again. I quickly climbed the step stool and turned the minute hand back to 12, resetting it to 3 a.m. My heart was still pounding as I stepped down, staring at the salt line that remained unbroken across the kitchen doorway. For the next hour, I stayed as far from the kitchen as possible, focusing on cleaning the dining area. I wiped the same table spot probably 20 times, jumped at every small noise, and kept checking the salt line to make sure it was intact. At 4:15, the bell above the front door jingled. I looked up to see a man in a trucker cap and flannel shirt walk in. He looked normal enough, average height, beard, work boots, but something about his eyes seemed off. They didn't quite focus on anything. "Evening," he said, sliding into a booth by the window. "Or morning, I guess." I approached cautiously, order pad in hand. "What can I get you?" He looked up at me, and I noticed he hadn't blinked once. "Nothing, just needed a place to sit." Warning bells went off in my head. He looked alive, no waxy skin or black eyes like the dead customer from before, but something was definitely wrong. "Sorry, but this is a business. You need to order something if you want to stay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man tilted his head at an odd angle, studying me. "You're Jay Burke." My blood went cold. I hadn't told him my name. "I think you should leave," I said, taking a step back. "You don't serve my kind, do you?" he asked, a smile spreading across his face that was too wide, stretching almost to his ears. "This establishment reserves the right to refuse service to anyone," I said, repeating the words on a sign near the register. The man stood up, still smiling that impossible smile. "Smart boy. Derek taught you well." He walked toward the door with a strange gait, as if his knees bent in the wrong direction. As he moved across the floor, I noticed something horrifying. Each footprint left a smoking mark on the linoleum, like acid burning through the surface. The bell jingled again as he left, and I rushed to the window to watch him cross the parking lot. Like the others, he vanished at the edge where asphalt met desert. I looked down at the floor where he had walked. The footprints had burned black marks into the linoleum, small wisps of smoke still rising from each one. I spent the rest of my shift cleaning those marks with every cleaner we had, but they wouldn't come out. They were permanent reminders etched into the floor, evidence that I wasn't imagining any of this. When Derek arrived at 6, I had a lot to tell him, and a lot more questions about what exactly this diner was, and why things from somewhere else wanted so badly to get in. I pulled into the parking lot of Eddie's Diner for my 4th night shift, my headlights catching Derek's Chevy already parked in its usual spot. Something felt off. Derek never stayed this late into my shift. I pushed through the front door, bell jingling above me. Derek sat at the counter, hunched over with his back to me. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tense. "Derek?" I called out. He turned slowly, and I stopped in my tracks. 3 deep scratches ran across his forearm, angry red lines that had soaked through the makeshift bandage he'd fashioned from a dish towel. Blood seeped through the white cloth in thin streaks. "What happened?" I asked, dropping my keys on the counter and moving closer. "Made a stupid mistake." Derek's voice was tight with pain. "Broke one of my own rules on the drive home this morning." I grabbed the first aid kit from under the counter. "Which rule?" Derek winced as I peeled back the bloody towel. The scratches were deeper than I'd first thought, the skin around them puffy and inflamed. looked directly at something I shouldn't have. He hissed as I cleaned the wounds with antiseptic. It was outside my car window, thought it was a coyote at first. But it wasn't, I said. No. Derek's eyes met mine. It wasn't. I wrapped fresh gauze around his arm, securing it with medical tape. You need stitches. Can't go to a hospital. Derek shook his head. They ask too many questions about wounds like these. He nodded toward the gauze. This'll do fine. So what now? I asked, packing away the first aid supplies. Derek stood up carefully, testing his weight. Now I need to go home and rest, which means you're pulling a double shift tonight. My stomach dropped. A double? But I've never... You know the rules. Derek cut me off. You'll be fine as long as you follow them. He reached into his pocket with his good arm and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote down one more. Something I should have told you earlier. I took the paper and unfolded it. In Derek's messy handwriting. If all doors and windows start rattling at once, ignore it completely. Don't look, don't react, just keep working. What happens if I acknowledge it? I asked. Derek was already moving toward the door. Just don't. He paused at the threshold. I'll be back at 6 tomorrow morning. Call me if... He stopped himself. Actually, don't call me. No matter what happens, stick to the rules and you'll make it through. The bell jingled as he left, and I watched through the window as he climbed into his Chevy, wincing as he used his injured arm to close the door. His headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled away, leaving me alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft chatter of the late-night radio host. I tucked the new rule into my apron pocket alongside the others and got to work. The next few hours passed in a blur of coffee brewing, counter-wiping, and serving the occasional trucker. By midnight, the diner was empty, and I'd fallen into the familiar rhythm of night shift work. At 1 a.m, I was refilling salt shakers when I heard it, a soft rattling from the front windows. I glanced up, expecting to see wind or maybe a customer arriving. The glass vibrated in its frame, and then the back door started too, its hinges creaking under strain. Within seconds, every window and door in the diner was shaking. The rattling grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get in from all sides at once. I remembered Derek's new rule. Ignore it completely. I forced myself to look away from the windows, focusing instead on the salt shaker in my hands. My fingers trembled as I screwed the metal cap back on. The rattling intensified, the glass panes flexing inward as if under enormous pressure. Just keep working, I muttered to myself, moving to the next salt shaker. Don't acknowledge it. The shaking became violent. Dishes slid off shelves, crashing to the floor around me. Coffee mugs toppled from their hooks. The radio cut in and out, the host's voice warping into unintelligible static. I kept my eyes down, methodically filling salt shakers as porcelain shattered around my feet. Sweat beaded on my forehead, but I didn't look up, didn't turn toward the noise. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finished with the salt shakers. I moved on to wiping down tables, stepping carefully over broken dishes. The floor was a minefield of ceramic shards, but I kept working, pretending the violent rattling wasn't happening. I was halfway through cleaning the third table when movement outside caught my eye. I almost looked up but caught myself just in time. From my peripheral vision, I could make out a small figure at the front window. The girl in the yellow dress, her face pressed against the glass. But something was wrong. There was another yellow blur at the side window, and another at the back door. I kept my head down, focusing on wiping the same spot on the table over and over. The girls were at every window now, 4 identical copies in yellow dresses, all staring in at me with their hands pressed flat against the glass. The jukebox clicked on by itself. Frank Sinatra's Blue Moon filled the diner, competing with the deafening rattle of windows and doors. I remembered rule number 2. Hide, until the song ends. But I couldn't hide and ignore the rattling at the same time. And now there were 4 identical girls watching me from every angle. I kept wiping the table, my movements mechanical. The song ended, but instead of silence, another tune immediately began. Patsy Cline's Walkin' After Midnight. The jukebox had never played consecutive songs before. A third song started as the second ended, then a fourth. The music blurred together as the rattling reached a fever pitch. Picture frames fell from walls. Light fixtures swung wildly. The floor itself seemed to vibrate beneath my feet. I glanced at the clock. 3:29, almost 3:30. I needed to reset it. I grabbed the step stool and positioned it under the clock, climbing up with shaking legs. I reached for the minute hand, but as soon as I touched it, the time jumped back to 3:29 on its own. I tried again. Same result. No matter how many times I turned the hands back, they snapped forward to 3:29 the moment I let go. The rattling grew so intense I could barely stay on the stool. The 4 girls in yellow dresses pressed harder against the windows, their small palms leaving foggy imprints on the glass. The jukebox cycled through songs faster now, just snatches of melody before moving to the next. In desperation, I grabbed the clock face and pried it open. With trembling fingers, I removed both hands completely, dropping them into my apron pocket. Everything stopped. The rattling ceased instantly. The girls in yellow dresses vanished from the windows. The jukebox cut off mid-note, leaving the diner in sudden, ringing silence. I climbed down from the stool on wobbly legs, surveying the destruction around me. Broken dishes covered the floor. Tables had shifted from their usual positions. Salt and pepper were scattered everywhere, but I was alive. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up, jumping at every small sound. I swept up broken plates, rearranged furniture, and wiped down every surface twice. The clock remained on the wall, its face blank and handless. By the time the sky began to lighten outside, I had restored some semblance of order to the diner. I sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, the metal clock hand still in my pocket, waiting for Derek's return. I'd followed the rules, or broken them in just the right way, and somehow made it through the night. But as I watched the desert outside turn from black to deep blue with the approaching dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had tried to get in tonight would be back. And next time, removing the clock hands might not be enough to stop it. After a month at Eddie's, I'd gotten into a rhythm with the night shift. The supernatural occurrences still made my skin crawl, but they'd become predictable in their own twisted way. I knew when to reset the clock, when to hide from the jukebox, and how to handle the girl in the yellow dress. I'd even started keeping extra salt containers under the counter. Derek and I had fallen into a comfortable routine during our shift changes. He'd arrive at 6 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the road, one black for him, one with cream and sugar for me. We'd sit at the counter for 15 or 20 minutes while I filled him in on the night's events. Had a visit from our friend in the dark coat again, I told him one morning after a particularly quiet shift. Just sat in the corner booth for an hour, never moved, never ordered. Derek nodded, taking a long sip of his coffee. He shows up about once a week, always the same booth. You ever wonder who he was? Before, I mean. Derek's face softened slightly. It wasn't quite a smile. Derek didn't really do smiles, but it was the closest thing to one I'd seen on him. Been wondering that for 20 years, he said. My theory. He was a traveler who took a wrong turn out in the desert, got lost, ran out of gas, tried walking to find help, and died out there. Derek looked down into his coffee cup. Desert's a dangerous place, especially at night. He tapped his fingers against the side of his cup, not just because of the heat or cold or getting lost. There are things out there, things that notice you. That was how our conversations went now. Derek would share bits and pieces of what he knew, never the full story, but more than he told me that first night. I learned he'd been working at Eddie's for 23 years, that the original Eddie had disappeared one night after closing, his car found abandoned at the edge of the parking lot, that the diner had changed hands 4 times since then, each owner selling it for less than they'd paid. "Why stay?" I asked him once. "Someone has to," he'd answered simply. We'd formed a genuine friendship over those morning coffees. Derek was still gruff, still serious, but occasionally I'd catch him almost smiling when I told him about how I'd handled something the night before. Which was why, when 6 o'clock came and went without Derek showing up one morning, I felt the first prickle of worry at the back of my neck. By 6:15, I was checking my phone every 30 seconds. By 6:30, I'd called him twice, with no answer. At 6:45, I made a third attempt, listening to the phone ring until it went to voicemail. "Hey Derek, it's Jay. Just wondering where you are. Call me back when you get this." I hung up and looked around the empty diner. The morning light streamed through the windows, making everything look deceptively normal, but something felt wrong. Derek was never late. Not once in the month I'd worked here. I called again at 7, then at 7:30. Nothing. By 8, I was pacing behind the counter, unsure what to do. The day shift cook and waitress would arrive at 9, but I couldn't just leave without knowing Derek was okay. When 9 o'clock finally rolled around, I explained the situation to Margie, the day waitress, a woman in her 50s who'd worked at the diner for years. "That's not like Derek," she agreed, frowning as she tied her apron. "He's never missed a day that I know of." "I'm going to drive by his place," I told her, "just to check on him." I'd never been to Derek's house, but I knew the address from some paperwork I'd helped him file last week. It was about 20 minutes away, a small house on the outskirts of town. The drive felt longer than it should have. The desert stretched out on either side of the road, empty and vast under the morning sun. By the time I pulled up to Derek's single-story house, my hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. His truck wasn't in the driveway. That should have reassured me. Maybe he'd just had car trouble, but it didn't. I parked and walked up to the front door, knocking firmly. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Derek, it's Jay from the diner." The silence that followed seemed to confirm what I already suspected. Something was wrong. I tried the door handle, not really expecting it to turn. But it did. The door swung open with an ominous creak, revealing a dim hallway. "Derek?" I called out, stepping inside hesitantly. The house was small and sparsely furnished. A worn couch in the living room, a small TV on a stand, a coffee table with a few magazines. Everything neat but modest. I moved further in, calling Derek's name again. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped cold. A chair lay overturned on the linoleum floor. Drawers had been pulled open, their contents spilled across the counters. A coffee mug lay shattered on the ground, dark liquid dried around it. There had been a struggle. Recently. My heart pounded as I took in the scene. No blood, at least. But signs of violence were clear. Something had happened to Derek, and I had a sickening feeling it wasn't a random break-in. That's when I noticed it. A folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. The only thing that seemed deliberately placed rather than thrown. I approached slowly, almost afraid to touch it. When I unfolded it, I recognized Derek's handwriting immediately. It was another list of rules. But these weren't rules for surviving the night shift. These were instructions for finding someone who had been taken by the entities that visited the diner. I read through them carefully, my hands shaking. 1. Gather these supplies. 1 pound of salt, 7 iron nails, and a silver dollar. Check my bedroom dresser, top drawer. 2. Return to the diner at sunset, not before. 3. Wait for the man in the dark coat. When he appears, follow him into the desert. 4. Make a circle of salt around yourself before you sleep. 5. Never look directly at anything that speaks to you. 6. The silver is for the gatekeeper. The nails are for everything else. 7. You have 3 days from the time of taking. At the bottom, in slightly messier writing, as if added in haste, Jay, I'm sorry. I knew this might happen someday. Don't tell anyone else. They can't help, and they might get taken too. D. I sank into a kitchen chair, the paper clutched in my hand. Derek had been preparing for this. He knew he might be taken, and he'd left instructions specifically for me to find him. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket, then went to Derek's bedroom. Just as the note said, in the top drawer of his dresser I found a small cloth bag. Inside were 7 iron nails, each about 4 inches long, and a silver dollar that looked old, its surface worn smooth in places. I gathered these items and left the house, locking the door behind me. In my car, I sat for a long moment, staring at the small bag in my hands. Everything I'd learned at the diner had been about keeping the supernatural at bay, about maintaining boundaries between our world and whatever existed beyond it. Now I was being asked to deliberately cross that boundary. To break the most important rule, never follow the dead man into the desert. I drove back to the diner in a daze, the morning sun now high overhead. I parked in my usual spot and just sat there, watching customers come and go through the front doors. Normal people having normal days, completely unaware of what lurked at the edges of their reality. I'd survived this long by following the rules, by hiding when the jukebox played, by not letting the little girl in the yellow dress inside, by resetting the clock before it reached 3:30, by never, ever following the entities into the desert. But Derek was out there somewhere. Derek, who had saved my life by giving me those rules in the first place, who had become my friend over cups of gas station coffee and quiet conversations at 6 in the morning. I got out of my car and walked to the edge of the parking lot where asphalt met desert sand. The same spot where I'd watched the man in the dark coat, the little girl, and other entities vanish so many times. The vast Nevada desert stretched out before me, seemingly empty under the bright sun. But I knew better now. I knew what was out there, hiding just beyond what normal people could see. I clutched the bag of supplies in my hand and felt the folded paper in my pocket. I would come back at sunset, just as Derek's instructions said. I would wait for the man in the dark coat. And for the first time since I started working at Eddie's Diner, I would deliberately break the rules. I would follow the dead man into the desert. I would bring Derek back.